Hello and welcome to episode 184 of the Clean Energy Show. I'm Brian Stockton.
And I'm James Whittingham. Welcome to the podcast. This week, a listener admonishes us for saying hydropower is clean. We looked into it, and if the smokestack has a carbon capture device, hydro is in fact clean.
If your hydro dam has a smokestack, that's probably the first problem. A Japanese city is experimenting with wireless charging for electric cars that are stopped at a traffic light. The amount of charge delivered will be quite small, but if they can add Formula One style tire swaps at the same time, they may really have something.
I need winter tires on and I don't want to wait. We have a size record in giant wind turbines again, Brian. It's always a special episode when that happens. It's so big, astronauts on spacewalks have to duck every time it rotates.
A Seattle startup is reimagining food trucks to run on batteries instead of fossil fuel generators. French fries and mini donuts will taste even better when made with clean energy. But unfortunately, they will still clog your arteries.
All that and more on this edition of the Clean Energy Show.
The race between climate change and the deployment of clean energy is on. The Clean Energy Show gives you a front row seat to the latest news in the transition to a better world.
And also this week's show, I outline some of my favorite clean energy podcasts that I think are credible. Road fuel sales are dropping in Norway. Can you guess why? Plus, the world-famous lightning round.
I just have a few updates from my trip. So, of course, last week we recorded, I was in St. Paul, Minnesota, and we drove home. It was a fairly short trip, just under a week. First of all, the day after, so we were there for the Judge John Hodgman podcast, a live recording. And just by coincidence, the following night, I just sort of looked at what else was playing at the same venue. So the following night, after John Hodgman, it was a really cool event called Demons. This is a movie from 1985, an Italian horror movie from Dario Argento. And it was performed with a live music soundtrack by the composer of the film, Claudio Simonetti, in this band called Goblin. It's like a prog rock band. And this guy has scored lots of horror movies, especially, stuff from the 80s, Italian stuff. And it was the first time I'd ever seen a sound movie with a live music score. So they had to get a special copy of the movie that had all the music removed. And then the band, this prog rock band called Goblin, played the score. It was super fun.
You were there. You saw this.
It was the next night, and I looked at it and I said, hey, let's get tickets for that. And we went.
Was it scarier having live music, more present?
Well, there's certainly more presence because it's a lot louder. Like as soon as the music kicked in, it's a rock band, so they've got the amps cranked up to 11. So, the score was really pounding. I wouldn't say it's a particularly scary film. It's got really good practical makeup effects. It's from 1985, and it's a real gore movie, like people getting ripped apart and stuff. But, it's fairly kitschy at this point. I wouldn't call it a particularly scary movie, but that was sure fun. It's been the year for me of seeing movies with live music. This is the fourth or fifth one we've seen this year.
Speaking about Judge John Hodgman, that's the podcast you went to see a live taping of. We have an overabundance of letters this week, I'm afraid. The second our podcast dropped last week, the letters started rolling in, and I don't know what to do with them all. I barely had a chance to read them, but I will promise everyone that we will read them, and we will take into account everything you have to say, and that will help us moving forward with our podcast. But there's an excerpt here from Ronnie in Houston who writes, when you mentioned going to the Judge John Hodgman podcast, I got a kick out of that. I've known Jesse Thorne since he started podcasting in 2006. Is that one of the hosts of the show?
Yeah, Jesse, he started the Maximum Fun Network, and he's the bailiff on Judge John Hodgman.
And I was one of the first batch of people to support MaximumFun.org. I met Hodgman many times, and they're both such great people in real life. By the way, did you know that Jesse recently transitioned Maximum Fun to a worker-owned co-op? Pretty cool model. There was a write-up in the LA Times and other blogs about that. That's what we should do here, Brian, is
worker-owned co-op.
Sure.
No, that's great. But yeah, the Max Fun Network, if you don't know about it, I think it's one of the best podcast networks out there. They've got dozens of shows now, so they're bound to have something that you like. But yeah, I've been listening to Max Fun since about 2008. And I'm a donor. Every month I donate money to Maximum Fun. And when you donate money, most of the money goes directly to the podcasts themselves. But then Max Fun as an organization has several employees. And yeah, they recently transitioned to a worker-owned co-op, which is really great. Jesse Thorne started the whole thing and grew it into this amazingly huge organization. And he decided to basically kind of give it back to the employees there. So that's now, worker-owned co-op. It's super cool. One more thing about Judge John Hodgman. Episode 201, he settled a dispute between my kids. So if you're interested in going back and listening to that, episode 201, it's a docket case, so they didn't appear live on the show, but my son wrote a letter and solved the dispute, and it was about Pee Wee Herman, so it's actually kind of timely now that Pee Wee Herman recently passed away, but that's episode 201. Anyway, I just wanted to talk some more about driving all the way back from Minnesota. It's about a 12-hour drive from St. Paul to our house. There were not a lot of electric vehicles in Minnesota. I was really surprised.
Suckers. They probably don't have a program. I mean, did you see any?
Yes, there was some, but I thought the concentration of electric vehicles is greater in Saskatchewan than it is in Minnesota.
Bold statement.
Which I did not expect.
Minnesota's not all that up to what it's cracked up to be. It's just, sure, Prince came from there. A lot of people have, but
Husker Du.
There's superchargers though. There's lots of chargers.
Yeah, there was lots of chargers, but a fairly small percentage. We stopped twice at the Alexandria, Minnesota supercharger, which is the one that's opened fairly recently, and it's got the Tesla Magic Dock. So it's got a CCS adapter built in, and so non-Teslas can charge. And so on the way back, there was both a Mustang and a Ford F-150 charging when we arrived. So I think I actually saw more non-Tesla vehicles at that charger than Tesla vehicles.
I think I've heard anecdotally that there's not a lot of non-Tesla chargers in Minnesota, and that might be one of the reasons why EV adoption is slow. I mean, it's like that here, but we're finally covering some of the dark spots on the map that needed some.
So there was a total of 3 on both trips that non-Tesla vehicles charging, and I think we only saw 2 other Teslas charging at that one. And then the final point is I talked a lot when I drove through North Dakota on my way to Colorado. I talked a lot about all the oil wells and all the flaring oil wells that I saw in North Dakota, but it was a nice change of pace. We took a different route this time, going up north through North Dakota and fairly close to the Canadian border, a massive wind farm we saw on our way. So
really?
Oh, it was great. Yeah, it was the sun was rising. I guess it wasn't that close to the Canadian border, an hour or 2 from the Canadian border.
North Dakota,
yeah. It was huge.
Because they're not known for anything. Sorry, North Dakotans. The Fargo Film Festival, but that's it.
I got a really great picture. I put it up on my Instagram. It was just sunrise and all these wind turbines on the horizon.
I assumed that was Minnesota. I did not know that was North Dakota. Congratulations, North Dakota.
Was North Dakota.
Speaking of the Ford F-150, there's been a lot of headlines about the Ford F-150 Lightnings not selling on dealer lots. People around here email and post things that there's one here and a couple there, and they've cut back their production of it, and then they've delayed the Silverado EV. Some people think it's because, Ford's not doing too well. Also, there's been reports that they're losing $30,000 a truck. I don't know how that makes any economic sense. That's a lot of money per truck.
Well, you have to start somewhere. Every electric vehicle maker is going to lose a bunch of money in the beginning, but you got to stick it out somehow.
I wish that they were in a position, and maybe they're not because of battery supply, to make the low-cost $40,000 fleet vehicle, because I think a lot of fleets are ready to buy them up. But because their prices have been fluctuating, they put them way up since they introduced it, and then they brought them back down again. So people don't really trust that. Plus, interest rates are ridiculously high. And the Cybertruck announcement is what, November 1st, right?
November 30th, they're going to do the Cybertruck.
November 30th, really? Oh, man, I can't wait that long. It is such a big announcement because we need to know. I think one thing that is going to be happening that we sort of talked about on the show is wraps, because Tesla did get into wraps. In spite of what you said, that they would never get into wraps, they're getting into wraps and charging a lot of money for them for their other car models.
It's so far just in California, so if you want to wrap your Tesla, you can do it. But yeah,
this seems like a perfect thing for the Cybertruck.
For the Cybertruck, because of course it's stainless steel, so they are not painted. They can't really even be painted, I guess. So a wrap would make total sense for that.
They're not all going to look like a tin garbage can. You know, you can sex them up with some different colors and also protect the surface, I guess, because, you know, stainless steel, and my fridge scratches pretty easily, and you don't have to go over it with a paste.
Yeah. And apparently there's two different kinds of wraps. There's vinyl wraps, and then there's another kind. I forget what it's called. So the vinyl wraps are cheaper, but they're not as good. So the ones Tesla are offering are, they're super expensive. It's $7,000 or $8,000 for the wrap, but it is at least the sort of better kind that I forget what it's called.
So last night I was minding my own business, Brian, watching an NFL game on my app on my laptop, because my kid in Saskatoon in a different city encourages me to watch the NFL with him. And I got served an ad from Alberta. The province of Alberta had this ad that made me so... it would have made me angry if I wasn't in such disbelief. It just completely floored me. An ad that they spent money on. They built a house. A family came home and said, "Oh, I thought we left the lights on. Well, why aren't the lights on?" And they step in, and there's water on the floor, and they keep going, and the roof has collapsed in the living room because the water pipes have burst. As you know, water pipes burst in blackouts. And they said, "Tell the federal government not to have restrictions on power companies, because it's going to raise your rates, quadruple your rates that you pay for electricity, and you'll have blackouts in the cold season in winter when there's less wind and less solar." I couldn't think of something more. There was no text on the screen quoting any study or anything like that.
Yeah.
They just pulled this shit out of their ass. And it's very frustrating. Here's a clip.
It's kind of cold in here, Mom.
Honey, didn't we leave the lights on?
Ottawa's proposed electricity regulations will make electricity unreliable and unaffordable.
Floor is soaked.
We could have regular blackouts during our coldest and darkest months, and power bills could skyrocket up to 4 times higher than they are today.
Bullpucky!
Yeah, that's horrifying. And I will point out, so Alberta and Saskatchewan are the two Canadian provinces that use the most fossil fuels.
Sorry.
You still good?
Yeah,
good?
It's going again.
Alberta and Saskatchewan use the most fossil fuels for the electricity grid, and we have the most expensive power already. Why would they think that it's somehow going to get cheaper if they keep using fossil fuels for it?
Study after study comes out, and I think the lowest savings I saw was 12%. Like, ratepayers would pay 12% less once the grid is transitioned. That seems low, considering that renewables are getting cheaper, and a lot of the transition will be done in the 30s when it's even cheaper than it is now, perhaps even half as much as it is now. That's with the utilities making lots of money off of it. And they're not going to build a grid that has blackouts. That's just
that would be grid mismanagement if it somehow results.
I think I've seen people say that the grids are going to be more stable in the post transition.
Was it Vermont a couple of episodes ago that they're going to put batteries into customers' homes, and they're expecting no blackouts by about 2030?
That's going to improve the blackout situation. The thing is, Brian, I'm concerned. You know, I'm concerned because the political pendulum is shifting in Canada. It's swinging far to the right again. The polls say that the right-wing party is going to annihilate everyone else, basically. They're going to have a mandate. This is if it happens, and it's getting worse every day, it seems. All because the leader dropped his glasses and got a makeover. That's all it took. In July, just things changed on a dime. So my son, actually, we don't have time for too much letters this week, but he sent me a text, and he says, "If I were the host of a podcast, say about green energy, I'd encourage my Canadian listeners to take advantage of any federal rebates currently being offered for said technology." He sends me polls every day, and they're depressing. I wish he would stop. But he's really into politics and numbers. Yeah, because 2025 is the latest that they'll be in power. So yeah, I don't disagree. I think if you're on the fence about an electric car, for example, and you want that $5,000 rebate, I wouldn't count on that after a change in power. And I certainly wouldn't count on any solar rebates. They'll do whatever they takes to support oil or their friends,
Yeah, these things go in cycles, and we are unfortunately due for a shift back towards the right here in Canada.
But every time we shift right, it gets more right. More anti-climate, more anti-science, and that's not... that ad is just shameless and god-awful. And I don't know if it's running nationally or because, we get a lot of Alberta ads on my sports app because they're just served Western Canada. And
they can, target specific regions,
But, you're going to scare the pants off people. It's pretty easy to say your power rates are going to go up. It doesn't take much to scare people.
Okay, and most people don't know what you and I and our listeners know. Okay, so this is about a Japanese city that's putting in a test, basically, for wireless charging at traffic lights. And I mostly wanted to talk about it because the idea of putting wireless charging into roadways, this is something we talked about on the podcast not that long ago. It's just unfortunately would be a very expensive thing that's maybe too difficult to implement. But they're trying a slightly different approach in Japan. This is a pilot project, and they're installing the wireless chargers at intersections where there's traffic lights. So the idea being that you stop at the red light, and if your car has the wireless charging infrastructure on it, you would get some charge while you're stopped at the red light for, just a minute or two. So a full minute of charging would give you about 6 kilometers of range. Makes some sense to test this in Japan because, of course, it's a very densely populated country where lots of people live in apartments. So home charging is an issue. So I think this is the kind of thing that they're trying to solve with this. But it's the same problem as any of the other wireless charging solutions under highways or whatever. It's just going to be too expensive. I mean, just think of you get so little charge after a minute, you'd really need to do it for pretty much every intersection in town for people to get kind of a meaningful juice out of it. And I don't know, that seems likely to be too expensive.
You have to have the car that is capable of doing it too. And there are some solutions, but they add weight to the car and the efficiency isn't great. You lose some in the efficiency of it. Now I can see use case scenarios like buses and cabs and taxis and robo-taxis that are concentrated in an urban area downtown. Who knows if that is a use case scenario that's worthwhile? I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. But they're testing it and they'll find out. As with everything, if they do it enough, it would be cheaper in the long run. But right now, it doesn't seem that practical. And charging buses, it seems easier to charge a bus from above, which they do in some places, if it does need charging, than from below.
And if it's above, you can make actual contact too. You can have an arm that goes up that makes actual contact, and then it's a more efficient way to charge.
You could put a whole lot of charge in there in 8 or 10 minutes currently. So that's something we'll keep an eye on. We'll also bring it up since our listeners are interested every time we see something like that and talk about it. We have some mail here that I'm going to touch on. I think we'll touch on just one letter this week. We can fill a phone book, Brian. Everybody, I'm glad everyone's written us. That's what I asked for. Keep writing. Keep writing. It says, hi, Brian and James. I saw this article below shortly after listening to this week's podcast, during which you again referred to hydro as clean, quote unquote. A while back on one of your podcasts, James sort of reluctantly mentioned the environmental impacts caused by dams. So I thought maybe you're finally realizing how horrible hydro is for the environment. But since that episode, you've repeatedly referred to hydro as clean. I'm okay with you referring to hydro and also to nuclear as low carbon, but both of these technologies are far from clean. The good news for me is that much of the rest of the world is waking up to the fact that hydropower has horrible impacts on the environment. It's time for you to acknowledge this too. This is Eric in the Bay Area, and he sent us an article, which I'll try and remember to put into the show notes. It's about Michigan rivers, them taking dams down because the rivers are heating up, and it's causing ecological damage. Hydro has gone out of, in the Western world, seems to have gone out of favor a long time ago. I mean, part of the reason is that all the hydro opportunities are sort of used up in North America, for example.
Yeah, the easy ones probably are, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's one, I think, Site C in British Columbia that's been going on for years and is very controversial, and they didn't consult with First Nations, and there's all kinds of problems with that. There's, Africa is talking about it, the Nile, without consulting other countries. Of course, China is throwing every possible energy generation source at their growing demand, including hydro, including giant hydro projects. And Brazil, I think, is notable. It's not like that's everything, but I mean, for the most part, hydro is stopped, right? Because it's not even competing on price anymore. And I think that one day we will take down the hydro dams, the bigger ones. We'll replace them with solar and battery and wind and everything else, or whatever else is available 50 years from now. But I don't know. I think it's going to be decades before we get to that because we have to decarbonize first. So a reminder that hydropower can cause environmental and social problems. This is from MIT. Reservoirs drastically change the landscape and rivers they are built on. Dams and reservoirs can reduce river flows, raise water temperature, degrade water quality, and cause sediment to build up. This has negative impacts on fish, birds, and other wildlife. People are right to think of hydro as a low-carbon resource, but the variability is very high, and there are some reservoirs that have life cycle emissions of greenhouse gases that are higher per unit of electricity produced than a fossil plant. You don't want to be advocating hydro everywhere. The World Bank estimated in 2000 that between 40 and 80 million people had been directly displaced by dams and reservoirs. Another study from 2010 estimated that 472 million people downstream from large dams suffer from reduced food security, regular flooding, or impacts on their livelihood. So while hydropower is a good source of clean, low-carbon electricity, even countries with plenty of untapped water need to weigh the benefits of hydro against the environmental and social costs of dam projects. There's still room for hydro to grow, but most countries will not build out as much hydropower as they theoretically could, and that may be for the best. So thanks for your letter. Again, we appreciate everyone who writes in. That's Eric from the Bay Area.
Yeah, there's a great documentary called Manufactured Landscapes about a famous, landscape photographer whose name escapes me at the moment. But they talk about the Three Gorges Dam in China in that film. And they say in the film that when they filled up the dam, this is the largest dam that's ever been built, it was actually enough to affect the rotation of the Earth slightly.
That's not good.
Yeah, that's not good. A massive, massive project, the Three Gorges Dam in China. And yeah, all kinds of people, they basically just flooded areas where all kinds of people were living. So yeah, hydro, not all it's cracked up to be. Low carbon is absolutely the better term for it. I think we just get lazy and call it clean. But it's very much, I think, the same kind of viewpoint that we have about existing nuclear plants. If you've got existing nuclear plants, you should probably keep them running, and existing hydro, keep them running, because those are both low carbon sources of power, and we need to switch as quickly as possible off of fossil fuels. And if we shut those things down now, that would not help the cause.
Yeah, even Greta Thunberg was all for not shutting down the German plants.
A story here from Electrek about food trucks. I love a good food truck, but they are quite often run by diesel or gasoline generators. If they're parked kind of in the middle of nowhere, they need to get power. And so frequently they are burning gasoline or diesel with a generator. So there's a startup in Seattle called Jewel Case, and they're making packages basically for food trucks, packages of batteries so that they can get off of their generators. This can be a huge source of emissions. There's a figure here. There's more than 35,000 food trucks in the United States alone, generating $1.5 billion in revenue.
How many?
35,000 food trucks in the
Wow,
US.
that's a lot of delicious food. But It's a lot of fumes too. I mean, if you think of a lineup of food trucks that aren't emitting, and the noise and the they're silent and they're clean. Like I don't like a lot of exhaust with my meal. I'll take it if I have to.
You don't want it. Now, we have a farmer's market every week in our town, and there's usually a bunch of food trucks, but they have access to electricity there. There's plug-ins for all the food trucks and for all the vendors. And then there's sort of an addendum here about movie production and a story from the Hollywood Reporter. We talked before about Vancouver, Canada, which is a very large movie industry, and they've started putting kind of electrical substations or plug-ins for film crews at various frequently used locations around the city. So that, is progress, but apparently Vancouver has one of the worst in terms of running generators. It's, the movie industry is huge, and those plug-ins are not enough to keep everybody rolling. So there's tons of diesel generators used in movie production. So it's all part of the same kind of thing, so many of these things can be replaced with batteries, and they're starting to make batteries for movies instead of diesel. And
you can put the battery right in the middle of the set if you want, and dress it up with a tree. It's not going to make any noise. It's not going to make any stink.
Yeah.
So
you always have to have those generators parked way around the corner. So they're not cheap. And I think, unfortunately, food service is generally kind of a low margin business. So not every vendor is going to be able to afford this. The base 30 kilowatt hour battery system, $21,000 US. So it's not cheap, but if you were starting a food truck business, this is the kind of upfront investment that would,
Well, you're running the sucker all day, Brian. You're running the sucker, I don't know how food trucks work. I don't know if they do like 8 hours or if they do like, 16. But I would imagine the thing's running a long time, constantly, unlike most vehicles, which only run about 5% of the time.
Yeah. And, there's different size packs you can get, but the base one is 30 kilowatt hours. You would think that would be enough to run a food truck for the day.
Maybe. Depends how many deep fryers you have.
Yeah. But anyway, the good news is that these systems all qualify for a 30% federal tax credit in the U.S. So there is some money back as part of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well, that's nice. That's 30% off my deep fried samosas. All right, I'm going to talk about a podcast now, one of two that I'll highlight on the show this week. My first podcast that I would like to highlight, and this is because, last week I felt like we caught fossil fuel ne'er-do-wells on YouTube putting up disinformation, and that is kind of depressing to me. So I thought I would, everyone who writes in says, I listen to a lot of Clean Energy Show podcasts, and yours is the one I never miss. I trust that that's true, but I hope that you're listening to good ones, and I'm going to suggest one here. Some of the ones that I listen to are a bit wonky. They're a bit policy heavy, and they may not be for your average person, but I'm going to throw them out there anyway. Maybe there's some episodes that you'll gravitate towards. The Energy Transition Show with Chris Nelder is one. Now, this is unfortunately a paid podcast, but he's got a 20-minute preview. Even though the podcasts are about half hour long, he's got a 10-minute preamble and then 20 minutes of interview. And then it cuts out just when you want the most. It says, no, you've got to pay for the episode.
Yeah.
Tease. Anyway, I do listen to it a lot. Stephanie Cook, she was on the show. She has literally written the book on the untold history of nuclear power. As the former editor of Nuclear Intelligence Weekly and the author of In Mortal Hands, A Cautionary History of the Nuclear Age, she brings over 4 decades of experience as a professional nuclear industry journalist, and she was on the show last week, and she started in the 80s and was pretty much pro-nuclear, and then she changed her thoughts over the years. A lot of it had to do with safety as she talked with people, and now it has a lot to do with cost, but she's still worried about safety. But this is a clip from that show.
Well, the story really starts with a despondent U.S. President Eisenhower wondering how he can soften the image of nuclear weapons for the public. Remember, this was the 50s. We had the spectacle of Hiroshima, Nagasaki. And people were beginning to realize just how monumental the consequences of those bombings were. So he and his advisors came up with the Atoms for Peace program, which he ultimately sold in a strong speech before the UN General Assembly. Then the United States set up the Atomic Energy Commission to oversee and really promote nuclear power. But there was one major problem at that time, which is kind of interesting to note, which is that firms like General Electric and Westinghouse, which had been involved in the Manhattan Project and well understood the dangers, refused to take on the liability for possible accidents. So Congress was forced to pass legislation, which is known as the Price-Anderson Act, under which the industry accepted only a minimum amount of liability. The amount today is about $13 billion. But the public had to take on the rest. Without that, the industry would not have developed.
So nuclear is highly subsidized in the United States and much of the Western world, obviously, most of the world, period, because private investors never wanted to be on board. They refused to to go on board because of the risk, the liability risk. So they limited that to the United States in order to develop nuclear. And also, I wonder, Brian, if 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl didn't happen. 3 Mile Island was at the end of the 70s and Chernobyl was in the 80s. If those two things didn't happen, I think nuclear would have kept going. And I wonder if our world would be better decarbonized now with less CO2 into the air if we had gone ahead with nuclear back then. Because back then we didn't have technologies to deploy like wind and solar like we do now. That was really all we had for low carbon energy, that and hydro, of course. So I don't know. I just wondered if those accidents didn't happen. Of course, they also made it more expensive. Every time there's an accident, and they have to redo the way they think about nuclear. They also talked about nuke nuts, and that is people who are pro-nuclear and will not hear any contradictory criticisms or facts or anything like that. They see it as a religion. I've come across that. There's people on our show that probably stopped listening to our show when I badmouth nuclear, or at least the potential for nuclear or the need for nuclear. And these people who are policymakers actually agree. So industry promotes itself, the nuclear industry promotes itself as a solution to climate change. That's what they've been doing. And they've got politicians falling for that, but not too many private investors. Taxpayers and ratepayers end up on the hook, including the subsidies for new nuclear. And they also argue that nuke talk actually slows down the transition. So
yeah, and if speed wasn't one of our primary concerns right now, then maybe there's more of a place for nuclear. But we have to do this immediately. We can't wait. And unfortunately, if you start planning a nuclear power plant, that means you likely stop planning solar, wind, and batteries, which could be deployed immediately. So, just the speed that we need to do this at, if this wasn't a climate emergency, then maybe, but it is a climate emergency.
And that's what our local governments, a few of them, including ours in Canada, are doing. They're using nuclear as a tactic to delay the transition because they want to burn as much fossil fuels as they possibly can.
They love it.
And suck up every dollar.
They love the smell of fumes in the morning.
And I'll get to another podcast after your next story.
Yeah. So $3.5 billion has been announced for U.S. grid improvements. This story comes from Electrek. This is the largest ever investment to upgrade the grid. So, and this is not actually the Inflation Reduction Act. This is a different set of money from the U.S. A lot of, one of the common criticisms that we talk about on the show is, when everyone switches to electric vehicles, the grid's going to crash. We're not going to have enough power. And we laugh that off and say, well, that's, of course, ridiculous because it's a slow transition. But if we did nothing to the grid, if we did nothing to upgrade the grid, then that would eventually come true. But those who know how to manage a grid are working on this problem now before it becomes a problem. So the U.S. Department of Energy has awarded $3.46 billion in grants so far. This is the first round of $10.5 billion in the Grid Resilience and Innovation Partnerships Program, the GRIP program, and it's grant money that comes from the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is something that the Biden government has passed. So this is 58 projects across 44 states. This is to help prevent blackouts. This is very much an infrastructure project. They're also investing in 400 microgrids, and 3 of the 4 projects will partner with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers to get those going. Some of these are just about grid resilience. So Hawaiian Electric is getting some money, and that's going to go towards wildfire prevention and mitigation efforts. Wildfires often bring down the grid. So if we can plan better to plan for wildfires, then that's less of a problem. So this is great news. It was just recently that the International Energy Agency called for rapid improvement and expansion of the grid. So the IEA has said that we need to do this, and you and I know that we need to do this, and it's starting to happen.
And this is necessary so that we don't have blackouts after the transition. We want to be able to share renewables from region to region, get that clean power where it's sunny and windy over to somewhere else. And that's the most challenging part of the transition right now, is to build out the grid because, you have to buy land, it's expensive, and people don't like it. There's a lot of not in my backyard business. I was watching something, I think that they're going to spend a lot of this money on wildfire resistance and, like putting cables underground. It's very expensive. I was reading this thing about it was very expensive to put cables underground, a lot more, like millions per mile. And it's cheaper than, there's other ways of making it resistant above ground. I think that in the wooded areas, you actually coat the wires. You have they're not bare wires. They have a coat, but if the line gets knocked down, then it's still going to ignite a fire.
Mm-hmm.
But if a tree branch hits it, it's not going to start a fire. Yeah, I think they're going to do more. My fear is that they're going to do more to protect their own butts from natural, climate change events that's happening now, rather than grid resilience, which we really need to do. And that's going to take a lot of money to do. So my second podcast is The Energy Gang. Yeah, so they had a podcast out. This is, I think the people on it vary sometimes from week to week, but generally they have the same people. There is Ed Crooks hosts the show with Robbie Orvis and Amy Myers-Jeff. Robbie is a senior director of modeling and analysis at the think tank Energy Innovation, and Amy is director of NYU's Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab. And they had a podcast episode this last week that about 50 years, almost to the day, since the 1973 OPEC oil embargo on the U.S., and they wondered how much has changed, and there's an episode about that. They also touched on the hydrogen hubs that you talked about last week that are getting put up around, and they've questioned whether there is a buyer for the hydrogen hubs. There's one case where there's Amazon, but apparently if they replace all the hydrogen that's currently in use now, there's still a lot left over, and they need people to buy this hydrogen and use it for something, but that's perhaps a long ways away.
There seems to be a lot less interest from the people that ought to be buying the hydrogen in actually spending money on it, and in particular on spending money on what's often going to be a higher cost solution, sometimes a much higher cost solution relative to either the potentially high carbon technology they use at the moment, or sometimes even compared to other low carbon technologies. So yeah, I think that's the real issue. And when I think about what's it going to take for these hubs to succeed, I do think finding uses for the hydrogen is going to be absolutely critical. And I think, as you say, it's not that there are no potential uses for low carbon hydrogen. I think that markets that currently use hydrogen, markets like fertilizer production, the refining industry, some other industrial uses, they're definitely potential customers for it. I think that, as you say, heavy trucking, where I'm still pretty skeptical about battery electric vehicles really working. Battery heavy trucks seem like a problem because of the power to weight issues.
And charging a battery heavy truck.
And charging, yeah, exactly. So kind of long haul heavy trucks, perhaps fuel cells with hydrogen are going to be the solution there. It's possible, as you say, marine, we don't have a lot of other great options for shipping fuel. Maybe something hydrogen based is going to work there. So there is potential, but I still think that's not nearly kind of worked through enough. And I think if you really want this low carbon hydrogen industry to work, that question of where the demand is something people have to put a lot more effort into.
If you have a podcast that you would like to recommend, email us at cleanenergyshow@gmail.com, cleanenergyshow@gmail.com. Brian?
Yeah, great thoughts about hydrogen there. Okay, we're going to talk about Norway very quickly. We love talking about Norway because I think everyone knows by now they're really the leader in switching to electric vehicles. They've made the conditions very favorable. They're getting close to 100% of new car sales being electric. But of course, the problem is that there's still a large existing fleet of gasoline and diesel cars, which are going to take quite a while to kind of age out of the fleet. But, we often talk about tipping points, and there's enough electric vehicles on the road now in Norway that the Norwegian Statistics Agency, SSB, just released its numbers on motor fuel sales and showed a 9% decline year over year from this September to
year over year.
9% decline in fuel sales, diesel and gasoline.
It just goes to show, Brian, that Norway is the future.
Yeah.
If you want a crystal ball into what the future will look like, at least in electrified transportation, start with Norway. And that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
9% in 1 year.
And it's a small country. There's not that many people there. But, the United States of America will be at a similar tipping point not too far in the future. I mean, it's never coming fast enough. But, a few years from now, imagine a large country like the U.S. experience a 9% drop in fuel sales. That's going to be a huge, huge deal. And, it's not that far away.
All right. Well, of course, it brings us to the end of the show where it's time for the lightning round. Oh, I got to stop it. Ronnie in Houston, we heard from him earlier.
Yeah.
He said in his letter, this is another excerpt from his letter, he said that the boom for the lightning round always blows my ears out when I have in earbuds. I often listen with tools in my hands and can't turn it down fast enough a lot of times. So, Ronnie, this is your warning. Put your tools down, adjust the volume on your earpods. We'll give you a little bit of a warning now. And I can't replicate your problem personally. I tried it with headphones. I don't know if it's a setting on your phone or your app. I can't replicate it being louder, but just so you're comfortable, we're going to delay the lightning round and give you a better chance. Plus, I've taken it down to 75% of its original volume, and we apologize if we've caused you to drop any tools or have hurt your hearing in any way. It's time for the lightning round.
The lightning round is a fast-paced look at the latest headlines in climate, clean energy, and transportation.
Colorado's Air Quality Control Commission unanimously approved a new Colorado Clean Car Rule, which essentially follows California's advanced Clean Cars 2 rule, but falls short of setting a 2035 target for 100% EV sales. The new Colorado rule targets 82% new EV sales by 2032, which is in line with what California's target for that year is, but does not set targets beyond that date. Several other states have adopted the rule, including New York, Washington, Oregon, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Maryland. Washington has even done one better, setting a target of 2030. Good for them. Amazon now has over 10,000 Rivian electric delivery vans in the United States. Still waiting for my parcel to be delivered by an electric vehicle and delivered to the right house. You know how frustrating it is to have a parcel delivered to the wrong house?
The worst.
And they send a picture in the email to you showing you that they delivered it, but you can't recognize the house and you're looking around your block. That happened to me last week. And I finally got it for free because the neighbor, 6, 7, 8 doors down, my daughter, by the way, figured out what house it was, but the parcel was gone by then. They didn't take it over right away, so I complained and got my refund, and then they took it over, so I got the thing for free. Ooh. But it serves them right for delivery to the... I have giant letters on my house, Brian.
Yeah.
I have this big gray monolith of a house. And the first thing I did was add a big black mailbox and the biggest letters I could find for the street address just to add some contrast. Not good enough for the Amazon delivery drivers. They're probably overworked. UNESCO denies a claim by the Zimbabwe River Authority that its World Heritage Committee had cleared the construction of a dam downstream from Victoria Falls. It's time for a CS Fast Fact. California has the most EV chargers of any U.S. state. New York is second, but can you guess who is third? No, you can't, because it's Florida.
Wow.
Surprised?
Yes.
Soil your pants? From the Seattle Times, in all 4 buildings under construction in South Lake Union for Alexandria Real Estate Equities, it will share a series of underground pipes tied together by a heat exchanger. The system works similarly to a heat pump gathering warmth from sewage. Do you know how you can have a heat pump or heat exchanger in your drain pipe? I've always wanted one. I've wanted one for 20 years. Well, they're doing this for a series of commercial buildings. They're going to take the heat out of your poop and your showers, and they're going to use it in the heat exchanger and put it back into the buildings. And the technology's official name is sewer heat recovery.
No, what I believe there's a Saskatchewan company that does something similar. Can't think of the name right now, but
Well, somebody write us. Toyota signs deal with Tesla for NACS. That is the Tesla charging standard. So Toyota's on board. All they have to do, Brian, is make an EV.
Yes, please do, Toyota.
VW, they're the one EV they made, the BZ4X, it's not designed to be charged for a road trip, that there's a certain charge limitation within 24 hours. That's just, you're not trying when you're doing that. You're boo. VW and Stellantis are still yet to announce, but who cares? They will. It's all a done deal. It's time for another CS Fast Fact. This is from Bloomberg. Between 2000 and 2022, the parts per million 2.5 pollution dropped by more than 40% on average, according to EPA data in the United States. Pollution is dropping. Air pollution. This is largely to do with fuel efficiency in cars, by the way. Since 1990, U.S. levels of nitrogen dioxide, a precursor to ozone, have declined by more than half. But they're under a challenge from climate change because climate change is making the cities hotter, which makes more ozone pollution. Half of the world's economies are already 5 years past a peak in power generation from fossil fuels. Half the world's economies, Brian, already are past the peak, and where are they going to go from there? Lower. New analysis from energy think tank Ember has shown that. And finally this week, from interestingenneering.com, it didn't take long at all, Brian. We have a new record size for an offshore wind turbine. We're jumping from 18 megawatts all the way up to 22, which is, these they went from 14 to 16 to 18. Yeah. Well, they're skipping 20, people. They're skipping 20, going right to 22 megawatts. With a rotor diameter, this is the distance between the tips of the blades, left and right, up and down, Eiffel Tower level. So you have basically a spinning Eiffel Tower. Wow. 300 meters, 3 football fields, 3 soccer pitches. 4 turbines give peak power of 1 fossil fuel peaker plant. Just 4 of these turbines would equal a fossil fuel peaker plant. And that is the lightning round.
Yeah, and that's it for our show this week. Please take the time to contact us, cleanenergyshow@gmail.com, and around social media, you can find us as Clean Energy Pod.
Go check out our YouTube channel. And special features are there, sometimes long clips from the show. Have a look at the Clean Energy store. Merchandise is yours to own, yours. And if you're new to the show, remember to subscribe on your podcast app to get new episodes delivered every week. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah, see you next week.
This Halloween, treat your ghouls and goblins with Clean Energy Show brand peanuts. Handpicked by Brian Stockton on my Georgia farm. They're the most sustainable and delicious nuts you'll eat this year. Next up on your podcast playlist, Joe Rogan discusses how vaccines cause forest fires.